Ever felt like you're walking on eggshells with a woman, unsure of what to say, do, or how far to go without crossing a line? What if I told you there's a way to subtly guide her behavior without ever raising your voice, begging for respect, or playing mind games? It's not manipulation, it's mastery. And it starts with one powerful concept, the invisible fence method. In any relationship, especially romantic ones, the concept of setting boundaries is often misunderstood. Most people think boundaries require confrontation, ultimatums, or dramatic declarations like, "If you do this again, I'm leaving," or "You better not cross this line or else." But here's the truth. The strongest boundaries are the ones that don't need to be said aloud in anger or desperation. They're not threats, they're principles. They're lived, not shouted. When you truly understand this, you begin to realize that the most powerful form of influence over someone's behavior is your quiet, unwavering consistency in how you react, or more importantly, how you don't react. Because in a mature dynamic, people learn what's acceptable by watching what you tolerate without ever needing a lecture. For instance, let's say you're dating someone who frequently flirts with other men in front of you. Now you could confront her aggressively, demand she stops, or threaten to leave. That's the reactive approach, loud and emotionally charged. But what happens next? Often she'll accuse you of being insecure, needy, or controlling. She'll focus on how you said it, not what you meant. The issue gets buried under defensiveness. But imagine another approach. You observe the behavior once, and instead of reacting with anger, you quietly distance yourself. You become colder, less available, less engaged, not in a petty or manipulative way, but in a natural, self-respecting one. You don't chase, you don't explain, you simply shift. She picks up on the change. She senses the emotional withdrawal. And if she cares about you, she'll feel that shift like a wave. She'll start to rethink her actions. She'll start to wonder why you're no longer investing with the same warmth. That's the invisible fence. That's the boundary. No ultimatums, no shouting. Just a quiet shift that speaks louder than words ever could. The beauty of this kind of boundary is that it doesn't rely on force. It relies on clarity. You're not trying to control her. You're showing her that certain behaviors simply don't have a place in your life. You're not teaching through punishment. You're teaching through absence. And this is especially effective because it creates a mirror. She's forced to reflect on herself rather than defend herself from you. The difference is subtle, but incredibly impactful. You're no longer fighting to be heard. You're letting your silence and distance communicate everything she needs to know. One of the most dangerous patterns men fall into is trying to get women to respect boundaries after they've already been crossed repeatedly. That's when ultimatums show up, but by then, it's usually too late. Because here's the thing, ultimatums are what people resort to when they've tolerated too much for too long and feel like they're losing control. They come from desperation, not power, and most women can feel that immediately. She knows when you're making a threat you don't have the courage to follow through on. That's why the boundary without the ultimatum is so potent. It removes the power struggle entirely. She's not being forced into a decision. She's being given space to choose how much your presence is worth. Let's take another example. Suppose you've been dating a woman who cancels plans at the last minute or makes you feel like an option. You don't text her paragraphs explaining how hurt you are. You don't lecture her on respect. You simply adjust. You stop initiating. You stop prioritizing her. You redirect your energy elsewhere. You're not being passive-aggressive. You're making a silent statement. I value my time, and if you don't, I won't continue giving it to you. If she reaches out asking what's wrong, you don't guilt-trip her. You don't grovel for attention. You calmly and briefly say, I noticed a pattern, and I've chosen not to chase after what's inconsistent. That's it. No games, no drama, just a clear standard. This leaves her with a choice. Not a command, not an ultimatum. And in that space, she's far more likely to choose the behavior you deserve if she truly wants to stay in your life. Boundaries without ultimatums work because they rely on internal strength, not external control. They make people want to rise to your level rather than feel pushed or pressured into submission. And when a woman respects you because of the energy you hold, not because of the threats you make, the entire dynamic becomes more powerful, more honest, and more aligned with mutual respect. It forces you to become the kind of man who leads by example, who influences not by fear, but by the clarity of his standards. Because the truth is, what you tolerate teaches people how to treat you. If you can master the art of non-reactive boundaries, calm, firm, and consistent, you'll rarely ever need to raise your voice or issue ultimatums again. Behavioral conditioning is one of the most overlooked yet naturally occurring dynamics in every human relationship. Whether we're aware of it or not, we are always responding to reward and consequence. In romantic relationships, especially between men and women, this dynamic is constantly at play, but few people are conscious enough to use it intentionally. Now, let's get one thing straight. This isn't about control. It's not about manipulation, force, or coercing someone into being who you want them to be. It's about understanding how human behavior naturally adjusts itself based on consistent responses, or lack thereof. When used ethically and maturely, behavioral conditioning becomes less about training someone and more about creating a relationship culture where certain behaviors thrive and others naturally fade away. Take, for example, a man who constantly gives a woman attention, compliments, gifts, time, and energy, even when she's cold, dismissive, or unappreciative. What is he teaching her on a subconscious level? That his presence and resources are unconditional, regardless of how she treats him. Without knowing it, he's reinforcing her dismissiveness. He's conditioning her to believe that she can give less and still receive more. Over time, she starts to feel less excited about his attention, not because she's heartless or selfish, but because humans instinctively place less value on what comes without effort. Now, reverse the scenario. Imagine that same man begins to pull back slightly when she's dismissive, not in a dramatic or confrontational way, but in a calm, centered manner. Maybe she's distant for a few days, and instead of chasing her or over-explaining, he simply lets the space grow. He doesn't reach out. He doesn't chase. He shifts his focus. And then, when she re-engages with warmth and presence, he responds fully again. What's happening here? Without saying a word, he's reinforcing a dynamic. When she brings warmth, she gets access. When she brings coldness, she gets silence. That's behavioral conditioning, not as a weapon, but as a natural filter. This method isn't about playing hard to get or creating emotional games. It's about shaping the emotional climate of your relationship by consistently reacting in alignment with your values. It's about using absence and presence as communication. Just like a thermostat responds to temperature, people respond to emotional feedback. If a woman knows that every time she disrespects you, you argue with her or beg for understanding, she's subconsciously learning that disrespect gets a reaction. And for many people, any reaction, especially an emotional one, feels like attention. It keeps them emotionally engaged. But when you remove the emotional payoff from bad behavior, the behavior often dies on its own. This is where most men struggle. They confuse standing up for themselves with reacting emotionally. But emotional reactions only fuel the very behavior you're trying to stop. Let's take a deeper example. Suppose you're seeing someone who has a habit of flirting with other guys on social media. Instead of confronting her in a jealous, angry rant or demanding she take down posts, you simply begin to limit your availability. You don't respond as quickly. You no longer go out of your way to affirm her emotionally. You let your silence speak. And when she brings up the change, you calmly express that you're turned off by behavior that lacks mutual respect. You're not threatening her or trying to control her. You're simply drawing a line with your energy. You're showing, not telling, that if the relationship environment becomes one you don't feel good in, you won't fight to stay in it. Over time, she either adjusts or reveals she never valued the relationship to begin with. Either outcome brings clarity. This approach is powerful because it shifts the responsibility of change onto her. You're not dragging her to become the woman you want. You're holding your position and letting her decide whether she wants to step into alignment with your standards. What makes this so effective is the complete removal of control. You're not asking her to change. You're not demanding anything. You're simply giving feedback through your behavior. If she adds value, she gets more of your presence. If she drains value, she gets less. It's very similar to how we engage with all aspects of life. You return to the restaurant where the service is great. You avoid the one where the staff is rude. You continue watching a series that's getting better with each episode. You stop watching the one that disappoints you week after week. The same logic applies here. People are always learning how much they can give or take based on what is allowed and what is quietly rejected. In this framework, women aren't being manipulated. They're being given a reflection. They're seeing the consequences of their actions, not because you yelled or guilt-tripped them, but because you stood still and let their behavior echo. This creates a subtle but powerful loop where they start self-correcting if they genuinely value you, because what you reward is what you grow. If kindness, thoughtfulness, and emotional presence are consistently met with warmth, intimacy, and access to your world, those behaviors become more frequent. But if disrespect, inconsistency, or emotional chaos are met with distance and disinterest, those behaviors begin to feel unrewarding. People instinctively gravitate toward what makes them feel acknowledged and valuable, and avoid what leaves them empty. The dynamic of reward and withdrawal is one of the most subtle yet powerful forces in shaping behavior within relationships. Whether we acknowledge it or not, every interaction we have with someone else is either reinforcing or discouraging specific behaviors. For men, especially in romantic contexts, mastering this dynamic can be the difference between being respected and being taken for granted. The problem is, many men operate in extremes. They either over-reward to the point of being walked over, or they withdraw completely out of frustration, creating coldness and resentment. But the true strength lies in understanding how to balance both reward and withdrawal in a way that creates clarity, mutual respect, and emotional alignment without needing constant confrontation or drama. This isn't about manipulation. It's about energetic balance. It's about being aware of the messages your behavior is sending, whether intentionally or not. When you reward a woman for behaviors that align with your values, kindness, loyalty, emotional presence, respect, you're reinforcing those behaviors. You're letting her know that these actions make you feel safe, seen, and drawn to her. The reward can be anything: your full attention, emotional intimacy, physical closeness, quality time, thoughtful gestures, or even the way your tone softens when she's acting in alignment with your standards. These are signals that she is in sync with the energy you're trying to build. Conversely, when her behavior veers into territory that threatens your peace, whether it's sarcasm that crosses a line, inconsistency, emotional manipulation, or blatant disrespect, your most powerful response is not to argue, explain, or try to convince her to change. It's to withdraw your energy, not as punishment, but as a recalibration. You don't have to get cold or cruel. You simply reduce access. You stop feeding attention into a behavior that drains you. Because when you continue to give the same reward despite the quality of treatment going down, you're signaling that your standards are flexible. And once that perception is created, the respect begins to erode quietly and deeply. Let's look at an example. Suppose you're dating a woman who's generally sweet and attentive, but every now and then, she gives you the silent treatment after a disagreement. The first time it happens, maybe you try to smooth things over. You call her, text her, explain yourself, make jokes, essentially working to re-establish connection. She doesn't respond, but eventually comes around after a few days. What just happened? She created a behavioral loop. If I withdraw emotionally, he'll chase me harder. Now you've unintentionally rewarded her silence with more of your attention. She may not even be aware of this pattern consciously, but the conditioning is already taking place. Fast forward to the next disagreement, she does it again. Why? Because silence now equals control. But imagine a different scenario. After the first incident, when she goes quiet, you don't chase. You don't double text. You don't beg. You mirror the energy. You don't react at all. You go about your life. When she finally reaches back out, you're warm but not overly eager. You give her your presence, but you don't reward the silence. You don't make it comfortable for her to disappear and return like nothing happened. That subtle shift, your calm withdrawal, breaks the loop. She learns that distance doesn't get her more of you, it gets her less. The emotional incentive to shut down suddenly loses power. Another example. You're dating someone who consistently shows appreciation when you make time for her, who reciprocates your effort with joy and warmth. You naturally feel inclined to do more for her, not because she asks, but because her behavior invites more connection. This is reward in action. The relationship becomes a positive feedback loop. But if the same woman begins to take your efforts for granted, cancels plans frequently, becomes emotionally unavailable, or criticizes you often, and you continue showing up the same way, you're reinforcing her negative behavior. You're teaching her that your time, your energy, your love is available on demand, no matter what she brings to the table. There's no contrast. There's no consequence. But the moment you begin to withdraw, the tone shifts. You don't become bitter. You simply stop investing the same energy. You don't initiate. You don't force conversations. You don't plan anything. And if she asks why, you tell her calmly, I match effort. This kind of response isn't dramatic. It's measured. And because it's grounded, it's respected. What makes reward and withdrawal so powerful is that it operates without words. It bypasses the need for lectures, debates, or emotional pleading. It lets your presence, or your absence, speak for you. In many cases, women aren't even aware that they're testing boundaries. They're simply reacting to what they can get away with. But once they feel the contrast, once they sense the shift in your energy when their behavior changes, they begin to self-regulate. They begin to realize that access to your world is earned, not given unconditionally. This doesn't make the relationship transactional, it makes it intentional. It ensures that the connection remains mutual and that both parties are continually choosing each other through aligned behavior. There's a powerful difference between leading and dominating in a relationship, and the distinction is subtle but absolutely critical. Many men either swing to one extreme, becoming overly passive and deferential, afraid to offend or assert themselves, or they fall into the trap of dominance, believing that control, intimidation, or rigid authority is the way to command respect. But true leadership in a relationship doesn't need force. It doesn't shout or threaten. It doesn't dominate. It guides, it inspires, it holds steady, it creates emotional safety while standing firm in its direction. A man who leads without dominating is the kind of man women feel emotionally safe with, even when he doesn't agree with them, even when he doesn't yield to their every desire. That's because his leadership isn't about ego, it's about clarity, consistency, and calm confidence. When a man leads in this quiet, steady way, he does so by embodying values and direction. He makes decisions without hesitation, not because he wants to control every outcome, but because he understands that indecisiveness breeds insecurity. Whether it's something as simple as picking a place to eat or as complex as setting relationship boundaries, he doesn't wait for permission to act. He listens, but he doesn't rely on external validation. He invites her voice, her feedback, her presence, but he never sacrifices his sense of self to accommodate her whims. He doesn't fear disagreement. He welcomes it, knowing that real intimacy isn't based on constant agreement, but on mutual respect for difference. And he remains grounded even when she's emotional, upset, or testing his certainty, because he understands that women don't test to destroy leadership. They test to confirm it. She doesn't want to be led by someone who folds under pressure. She wants to know that when things get emotionally messy, he doesn't crumble or lose direction. Picture a man in a relationship where his partner tends to get overwhelmed emotionally. Maybe she overthinks, gets anxious, or spirals into worst-case scenarios. A man who leads without dominating doesn't shame her for this. He doesn't lecture her for being too emotional, nor does he submit to her storm. Instead, he remains centered. She's panicking, she's frustrated, maybe even trying to provoke a reaction, but he doesn't match her chaos. He lets her express, listens actively, but when she starts to drift into drama, he gently but firmly redirects the energy. He might say, "I understand you're upset, and I'm here, but let's talk when we can both be clear." He removes himself from the emotional explosion, not to abandon her, but to protect the space. That calm withdrawal isn't avoidance, it's leadership. It's the ability to say, "I won't let us destroy something important just because emotions are high." He's not trying to dominate her into silence. He's simply holding the emotional container. He leads by remaining unmoved in his emotional foundation, and that's what brings her back to calm. Not because he controlled her, but because she saw in him the grounding she couldn't find in herself in that moment. Now, contrast this with domination. A man who tries to dominate in that same moment would raise his voice, talk over her, or dismiss her feelings entirely. He might try to win the moment by asserting intellectual or emotional superiority, using logic as a weapon. He may throw in ultimatums or shut her down completely, and even if he wins the argument, he loses trust. She no longer feels emotionally safe. She begins to associate vulnerability with danger or dismissal. The relationship becomes one where she has to shrink herself to keep the peace, and that isn't leadership. It's emotional suffocation. Real leadership doesn't demand silence. It creates space for expression, while still guiding the emotional tone of the relationship. Leading without dominating also shows up in how a man sets vision. In any strong relationship, there needs to be a sense of movement toward goals, values, shared experiences. A man who leads will have clarity about what he wants from life and where he's headed, and he naturally invites his woman into that path. Not by telling her what she has to do, but by inspiring her to align with him because his direction feels secure and purposeful. She follows not out of obligation, but out of trust. She sees that he doesn't just react to life, he shapes it. And because he's intentional, he draws a partner who wants to contribute to something bigger than herself. He doesn't force her to follow his lead, he makes her want to. For instance, if he values fitness, growth, emotional maturity, or financial stability, he doesn't demand that she adopt those values. He simply lives them. And because he leads by example, she begins to mirror that energy. She joins him in growth because she sees that being next to him makes her better, not smaller. But if he were to dominate, he'd use shame, pressure, or guilt to get her to change. He'd impose his values rather than inspire alignment. And while that may produce short-term compliance, it kills long-term intimacy. It creates a hierarchy instead of a partnership. But leadership, real leadership, makes space for two full individuals to grow without one having to disappear. In any relationship, especially romantic ones, consistency acts as the silent teacher. It becomes the invisible fence that informs a woman exactly where your boundaries are, without ever needing to raise your voice or issue warnings. Most men underestimate how powerful consistency is because it's not loud or flashy. It doesn't come with emotional outbursts or heated arguments. Instead, it's slow, steady, and incredibly effective. When you're consistent in your energy, your standards, your values, and your emotional regulation, the woman you're with starts to understand, on a deep psychological level, what is acceptable, what is non-negotiable, and what crosses a line. You never need to scream, "I won't tolerate this," because your actions have already spoken. You've built a rhythm she can feel, and any disruption to that rhythm creates instant tension, like a current being interrupted. She learns quickly, not through confrontation, but through calibration. Imagine a man who holds certain personal standards, not just for how he expects to be treated, but for how he treats others, how he shows up, how he responds to adversity. Let's say he's someone who values mutual effort in communication. If someone he's dating is flaky, slow to respond, or inconsistent, he doesn't react with accusations or emotional punishment. He simply begins to mirror the energy. He stops initiating with the same frequency. He doesn't chase or overextend himself. He doesn't switch up who he is depending on her mood. She might test this. She might disappear for a day to see if he'll panic. She might ignore a message to see if he gets triggered, but instead of breaking pattern, he remains composed. He doesn't act cold or passive-aggressive. He simply becomes unavailable when inconsistency shows up. That calm, measured response becomes a cue. She feels it. She senses that she's dealing with a man who won't bend just to please her, but also won't retaliate to punish her. That kind of emotional posture creates a very specific kind of respect, because it teaches through predictability. And that predictability is the very essence of consistency. When a woman knows that your energy remains steady regardless of external variables, she stops testing in the same ways. She may still bring emotion, intensity, even a little chaos at times, because that's part of feminine energy, but she won't go too far. She'll recognize the edge, the invisible fence, because she knows you're not swayed by charm or tears or pressure. She knows that when you say you value respect, you actually do, and you prove it by withdrawing from anything that violates that value. That kind of man doesn't need to explain himself over and over. He simply holds the same line every time, and it's in that repetition that the message becomes internalized. Inconsistent men, on the other hand, are the ones who destroy their own fences. One week, they're strong, grounded, and emotionally unavailable to disrespect, and the next week, they're apologizing for standards they tried to enforce. They say, "I won't tolerate this again," only to give full access when that same behavior shows up. Women don't learn from words. They learn from patterns. And if your patterns change depending on how attracted you are to her that day, how lonely you feel, or how much you fear losing her, then your fence isn't just invisible, it's non-existent. Think about a man who says he values peace, and one day his woman starts a fight just to get attention. If he argues back, yells, defends, or chases her into resolution, he's breaking his own code. But if he stays calm, lets her blow off steam, and only engages once things settle, every single time, she eventually learns that chaos doesn't get a reward. Attention is not given to drama. Access is not granted when peace is violated. That's consistency at work. She adjusts, not because she was forced to, but because the feedback loop is clear and stable. He's not changing who he is depending on how she behaves. He's showing her that his values aren't just performative. They're embedded in his daily actions. Another example. Let's say you're a man who doesn't tolerate being talked down to or disrespected, not just by your partner, but by anyone. In public, you speak with dignity, and you expect the same. One evening, your partner crosses a line during an argument. Maybe she insults you, curses at you, or mocks you in a condescending tone. A man without consistency might lash back, say something worse, and later apologize, hoping to reset the connection. But a man with consistency will simply disengage from the conversation. He won't match the low vibration. He won't explain why it's unacceptable. He'll just remove his energy. Later, when things are calm, he'll re-engage, but without needing to rehash the past or beg for respect. The absence of his emotional investment during the conflict already said everything. If she tries it again, the response is identical. Calm disengagement. No reaction. No arguing. Just a quiet, firm refusal to dance in disrespect. That unwavering consistency becomes the fence. She either stops hitting that electric line, or she realizes she can't exist within it and leaves on her own. Consistency becomes not only a standard, it becomes a mirror. It reflects to your partner who you are and what you expect. It shows that you don't need to fluctuate to gain love, and that you won't abandon your values to maintain connection. When your energy is stable, your values consistent, and your reactions predictable in the face of disrespect or disconnection, the woman in your life knows exactly where the line is, even if it's never explicitly drawn. There's a rare but deeply rewarding dynamic in relationships where the woman begins to calibrate herself, not because she's forced to, threatened, or manipulated, but because the environment you've created naturally demands it. This is what happens when you, as a man, stop trying to control her behavior and instead focus completely on controlling your responses to her behavior. You stop lecturing her. You stop arguing for your worth. You stop trying to change her through words, and instead become a man who leads with action, silence, emotional control, and unshakable standards. And when this happens, when your energy is no longer up for negotiation and your values are non-transferable, she begins to adapt on her own. She starts training herself to show up in ways that align with your standards, not because you told her to, but because she feels who you are, because she understands intuitively that being with you is a privilege, and privileges come with a code. What most men never realize is that trying to verbally train a woman is often counterproductive. The more you try to correct her with words, criticize her decisions, or demand she behave differently, the more resistance you create. People don't change when they feel judged. They change when they feel inspired or challenged in a way that makes them reflect. A woman may smile and nod when you tell her what you want, but if her behavior never changes, your words meant nothing. But when she starts noticing that you go silent when she starts drama, that you're calm and unmoved when she threatens to leave, that you withdraw emotional access when she disrespects you, and that you only pour your full presence into her when she shows up with respect, warmth, and consistency, that creates a feedback loop that speaks much louder than any argument could. It creates a sense of emotional accountability. She knows that she is shaping the connection in real time by the way she behaves, and that realization starts to reprogram her responses. Let's look at an example. A man is dating a woman who is used to getting her way through emotional outbursts. In her past relationships, when she cried, yelled, or gave the silent treatment, the man would immediately apologize, even if he did nothing wrong. He'd chase, comfort, and eventually surrender just to restore peace. This taught her that emotional volatility equals control. Now she brings that same pattern into a new relationship, expecting the same results. But this new man doesn't respond to chaos. When she cries, he offers calm presence but doesn't jump into fixer mode. When she yells, he listens quietly but doesn't argue back. When she tries to guilt trip him or make him jealous, he simply steps back. He doesn't punish her. He doesn't insult her. He just becomes unavailable to low vibration energy. Over time, she begins to realize something powerful. These old tactics don't work here. They don't bring closeness. They don't create resolution. In fact, they push him further away. She starts self-regulating, not because he told her to, but because she sees that certain behaviors lead to disconnection, and she values the connection too much to lose it. That's when she starts training herself. In another scenario, consider a man who has an extremely high level of personal discipline. He wakes up early, takes care of his body, keeps his space clean, honors his commitments, and speaks with intention. He doesn't announce these things as requirements for the people around him. He just lives them. His woman, who may have come from a background of chaos, procrastination, or emotional instability, begins to notice the difference. She sees how calm his life feels, how reliable he is, how much peace and order surround him, and instead of feeling like she has to change to stay in his life, she starts wanting to. She starts showing up on time. She starts being more thoughtful. She starts handling her own emotions instead of expecting him to rescue her from them. Why? Because his presence is so stabilizing that she realizes she either has to rise to meet his energy or risk losing access to it. Again, he never asked her to change. He never demanded improvement. He simply modeled it and let her decide whether or not she could meet the standard. That's the woman who trains herself. She adjusts not out of fear, but out of deep respect. It's important to note that this shift only happens when a woman truly values the man she's with. If she doesn't respect you, or if she sees you as a temporary option, she won't care how composed or consistent you are. But when she genuinely sees your worth, when she feels your energy as something rare, steady, and emotionally clean, her behavior starts to reflect that recognition. You stop having to ask for respect. You stop having to correct her tone. You stop needing to spell out your needs. She watches, she feels, she learns, and she begins to mirror your standards, not to survive in the relationship, but to thrive in it, not to avoid punishment, but to keep connection, not to be controlled, but to feel like she's contributing to something meaningful and elevated. So, when you think about the idea of training a woman, understand this. It's not about control, manipulation, or dominance. It's about becoming the kind of man who holds such steady emotional boundaries, consistent energy, and unwavering standards that the environment itself reshapes behavior. You're not forcing anything, you're filtering. You're not begging for respect, you're embodying it. The woman who values your presence will adjust herself without ever needing to be told. She'll train herself, not because you demanded it, but because she recognizes that access to your life, your love, and your leadership is earned, not given freely to anyone who simply shows up. Be the standard. Let your silence, your distance, your peace, and your presence teach louder than any words ever could. The invisible fence isn't a wall, it's a reflection of your worth. Build it once, and the right woman will never cross it. She'll honor it, and in doing so, she'll honor you. Now, if this message spoke to something deep in you, I challenge you. Don't just watch this, live it. Be the man who leads quietly, holds strong, and never trades his standards for temporary attention. Because the moment you do, everything changes. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with a man who needs to hear it. Stay grounded, stay clear, and as always, choose peace over proving your point.